So amended and engrossed recommends do pass on House Concurrent Resolution 3037 by a vote of 10 yeas, 3 nays, 1 absent, and 0 not voting. Mr. Speaker.
Representative Power.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly. This resolution asks the citizens of North Dakota to remove from our Constitution a provision which basically states no money raised for the support of the Protestant public schools of the state shall be appropriated to or used for the support of any Catholic school. In the early years of the Republic, the public school system had a non-denominational Protestant religious character, which was considered necessary for a well-rounded education, and both public and private Protestant schools were funded by the state in a lot of instances. In the mid-1800s, with the influx of immigrants, many of whom were Catholic, considerable friction arose concerning which Bible and catechism to use. In order to reduce agitation and to protect the school system from Catholic influence and prohibit funds from being used for Catholic schools, an amendment to the U.S. Constitution was proposed by an influential politician named James Blaine. The effort narrowly failed, but supporters turned their attention to the states and there met with greater success, either through their legislatures or as a requirement in their constitutions for statehood. And that is how we got the Blaine Amendment in our Constitution. The word sectarian, rather than religious, was used in these amendments to distinguish the minority Catholic schools from the common schools, which were shaped by the majority Protestant beliefs. After this effort, every state provision which uses the term sectarian has generally been considered a Blaine Amendment and carries the onus of being bigoted and anti-Catholic. Opposition to this resolution argued that it gives public funds to non-public schools and may be unconstitutional based on the separation of church and state. HCR 3037 is not about providing financial assistance to non-public schools and is not unconstitutional. This resolution simply removes offensive language from our state's constitution. It was passed out of the Judiciary Committee with a 10-3 do pass recommendation, and we ask that you concur. Thank you.
Is there any discussion? Representative Rust.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the Assembly, I rise in opposition to HCR 3037. You have heard that this resolution is one that was born out of bigotry. I would submit to you that the real intent is all about the money. Repeal of the last sentence of Article 8, Section 5 is a necessary step in guaranteeing that the courts will not strip state dollars from non-public schools should legislation permitting that be passed. Earlier, this Assembly defeated a bill that would have provided up to 25% of the school district's cost of education to a non-public school that enrolled a student from that district. Had that bill become law, it more than likely would have been challenged in the courts, and it more than likely would have been negated in view of Article 8, Section 5 of the North Dakota Constitution. The root word for sectarian is sect. Some see its connotation as exclusively negative and associated with synonym cult. The word sectarian has a rightful place in Article 8, Section 5. It doesn't apply just to Christian non-public schools. It applies to all non-public schools united by a specific doctrine or by a doctrinal leader. North Dakotans may have reservations about public dollars going to a Christian non-public school. I believe those reservations would be greatly heightened if those schools' basic foundations were rooted in other religions, for example, Islam or the teaching of Sharia law. One of the facets of Article 8, Section 5 is that it does provide freedom from religion, as the founders of our Constitution, I believe, firmly wanted religion instruction and training to be done in the home and by the family, not by the state. The sentence in Article 8, Section 5 should remain in place. Once the door is opened, the state cannot discriminate on which religions are quote-unquote good or which are quote-unquote bad. The sentence had stood the test of time for 125 years. Members of the Assembly, I urge you to vote red on HCR 3037.
Is there further discussion? Representative Power.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Rust's argument has been used frequently, I think, to discourage any kind of a move in that direction. But the fact remains there are 12 states and the District of Columbia which have voucher systems. Of those 13, 10 have Blaine laws. It does not, our current law does not restrict that. For tuition tax credits, there are 11 states which have tuition tax credits. 8 of those have Blaine laws. 7 have both provisions. So obviously, the Blaine, although the school system, the public school system, teachers, etc., use it as an argument, it is obviously not a valid argument because it is used widely throughout the United States. In the District of Columbia, which has a Blaine Amendment, the federal government issues vouchers. The vouchers, both the vouchers and the tuition tax credit, none of them are universal in any of these states. They all are used, and I think the Democrats are like this, all of them are used for the disadvantaged, the handicapped, for the low income, and etc. There isn't a universal usage for that. Sometimes they're used by cities for inequalities. But thank you, sir.
Is there any further discussion? Representative Grande.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. One quick thing, the Founding Fathers never talked about establishment from religion. They actually established the school system on religion. This is the New England primer that was used by all of the founding schools and universities in our nation, and it's all biblically based. It was used all the way into the 1900s. The other thing I would like to note is it is not uncommon for us to remove bigotry language from our Constitution. As we remove the words deaf and dumb asylum, feeble-minded, from our code, the words idiot, and various other words that have been used. Make no mistake, we may have migrated and lost what was truly meant with the word sectarian. It is a bigot language. It is a language meant solely as anti-Catholic. Always look to the history of how something came about to understand why it's there. It is time that we move to the point where we do not contain bigoted language in our Constitution. Let's let the people vote about it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there any further discussion? Representative Kay Koppelman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. This has been an interesting discussion. We had an interesting hearing and debate on this issue in the Judiciary Committee. A couple of things that have been mentioned on the floor. I think there's a lot of confusion and some misinformation, not only on this piece of legislation, but also on this issue. We heard in the committee testimony that this is something that should stand in our Constitution because of the separation of church and state. I don't know how many times I've heard that. When I ask people where they find that, they usually say the Constitution. So I love to hand them a copy and say, show me, please, because it's not there. What is there is the First Amendment, which guarantees two things. Number one, that there will not be an established state church in the United States of America. And number two, that there will be freedom of religion. Not freedom from religion, freedom of religion in America. Sectarian, as has been mentioned, is a term, and I was very interested to hear the history, as I think our committee was really born in bigotry, and that's how this got attached to several state constitutions around our country. A couple of years ago, the Constitutional Revision Committee recommended a measure that came from one of our Democratic colleagues that removed the measure in our Constitution which would have allowed for a poll tax. We've never had a poll tax in North Dakota, but our Constitution would have allowed one. I don't think I need to go into detail about the racial bigotry that was involved in a poll tax. So, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly, the committee concluded, first of all, nothing in our Constitution either allows nor prohibits support of non-public schools or of private schools. It simply prohibits the support of sectarian schools. It's very different. If you had a private school that was a math and science school that had nothing to do with religion, there's nothing in our Constitution that would prohibit that. We'd still have the authority to decide whether to fund that in the legislature, which we would going forward with any of these other schools if this measure is passed by the people. But the term sectarian has a narrow meaning, and the more the committee heard about it, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly, the less we liked the term, and we felt this debate should go forward and we should allow the people of North Dakota to weigh in. So we would hope that you'd uphold the committee's recommendation and vote green.
Is there any further discussion? Representative Ammerman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess would Representative Koppelman answer a question, please?
Representative Koppelman, would you answer a question, please?
Mr. Speaker, I will.
Representative Ammerman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Koppelman, the language that struck, no money raised for the support of public schools, so on, and the sectarian, was there any discussion to keep all the language in there and just strike sectarian and put some language that would be compatible to that without striking the no money and all this?
Well, Mr. Speaker and Representative Ammerman, I don't believe that was the intent of the bill sponsor. I think the intent of the bill sponsor was to remove that particular phrase, and partially because of its origins, which we've talked about. Your question, could we have removed the word sectarian and have changed it to something else? I guess we could have, but that wasn't the original intent of the resolution, nor I don't think the committee felt should we change it to that intent.
Well, thank you, Representative Koppelman, Mr. Speaker. Then, I guess, in my simple mind, what I can take away from this goes to people. The intent was, if this passes, that the monies would go to, we could put money into private schools. That's what I can bring away from this. So I hope we can vote red. Thank you.
Is there further discussion? Representative K. Koppelman.
Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly, and Representative Ammerman, just to respond to that, again, there's nothing in the Constitution now that would expressly prohibit money being appropriated by the legislature to a private school. It does prohibit money being appropriated to a sectarian school, and we've heard the origins of that. Those that would prefer a broader definition of the term sectarian, even though the origin of the term clearly was anti-Catholic, I suppose you could say, you could stretch the meaning to say we couldn't fund a Lutheran school anyway, either, but it has to do with a sectarian religious school. If we had a charter school, for example, which I don't believe we have any in North Dakota, but if we passed bills here allowing for charter schools, those are public schools. If we passed a bill supporting some other kind of a private school that was not sectarian in nature, nothing in the Constitution that I read would prohibit that now. This simply removes that language. It is up to if the people pass this, if the Senate forwards it, if we forward it, and the people pass it, it simply leaves the policy-making decision to the state of North Dakota, to the legislature, in the future to determine whether or not we would fund any other kind of school other than a public school. I'd point out that we already do fund things like Home on the Range for Boys, I think, and the Girls and Boys Ranch and places like that do education. We do some things with Teen Challenge and so on. So there are some things that we're already doing. It would be up to us whether to decide whether or not to do that in the future. But I want to emphasize nothing in this measure appropriates any money to anybody. That would be something that would be up to future legislatures.
Is there further discussion? Representative Glassheim.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of the Assembly, my understanding is that what we're really voting on here is, do we want money raised for public schools to be given to religious schools? That's the upshot of what we're voting on. There are Protestant sects, there are Islamic sects, there are Catholic sects, there are many kinds of sects, but we understand that the word means in general religious institutions. Do we want to have public money raised from people of all religions, and some none, but all religions, going to any particular group of people who are not broadly publicly controlled? It seems to me that the Establishment Clause in the Constitution, as I understand it, means that when the state gives money to a religious body, they are helping to establish that religion. It is not a fully state-sponsored religion, that is true. But my understanding of how the court would interpret this is that when you give public money raised from people of many religions to particular religious groups, that you are helping to establish that religion, and that we want to separate. That's what we want to separate in our national constitution and at the state level as well.
Representative Power.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Glassheim is correct. If you give money to a religious organization or etc., it is a violation. I'm sure that would stand up. But there are, as I pointed out, many states which do use vouchers. In 2002, the Supreme Court, in a case called Zellman versus Simmons-Harris, they set out a test of with five items for determining if the Constitution in these voucher systems was followed. The one is that the program must have a valid secular purpose, so the program must have a valid non-religious purpose. Aid must go to parents and not to the schools. These vouchers all go across the state, go to parents. They don't go to the schools, to the churches. A broad class of beneficiaries must be covered. The program must be neutral with respect to religion. There must be adequate non-religious options. If those five criteria, if we passed a bill with those five criteria, I believe it would not be invalidated by our Blaine Amendment or the Establishment Clause. Thank you.
Is there further discussion? Representative Rust, second time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I grew up not far from here, about 50 miles up the road. I grew up in a small community. I grew up in a strong Baptist home. And all of the churches in our community were Protestant. And I recall as a young man growing up, there was talk about prayer in the school. And I remember that my father and members of our family strongly felt that that wasn't the place for it. Their comment was, it's a public school. In a public school, you have to do things that are neutral to the people who are attending there. It was their strong belief that religious instruction should take place in the home, by the family, not by the state. The state of North Dakota has long held that public dollars should not go for private causes. That is good policy. I also believe that if this issue were so important that there would have been an initiated measure that would have been drawn up by the people, and it would not have had to come from the legislature. Again, I urge you to vote red. Thank you.
Further discussion, Representative Grande, second time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a couple of points. When this was put into our Constitution, it was put in with a group of the western states that were coming in to be admitted into the Union. And in that, North Dakota was told that this amendment must be in there. They were coerced into adopting the Blaine Amendment under a promise of statehood. That is how bigoted our society had been at that time, and I want to make sure that we're clear on that point. And this does not bring religion into the public school. It allows for us to use our schools if it was something that the legislative body brought back to here. But this is not what the bill addresses. The bill is strictly addressing the removal of this bigoted language. We need to also note, it was brought up, but a majority of our justices currently sitting in the Supreme Court have already acknowledged that the historical connection between the Blaine Amendment is anti-Catholic. That is the sectarian that is in this wording. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Amendment, second time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In listening to the bill carry in the last comments he made, what concerned me, he was talking about the vouchers and the 5 points has to be in the vouchers and so on and so forth. He mentioned DC and so on. I'm not sure where that's coming from because this bill has nothing to do with vouchers. It's just to take it to the vote of the people to change their constitution. But what worries me that if this would pass and pass for the people, then the next time we come here, then somebody's already looking ahead about vouchers and what needs to be in vouchers and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure what the plan is, but I just hope we can vote red. Thank you.
Is there any further discussion? Representative Clemene.
Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly, we just can't remove this language here without looking at what's left. And what's left says that all educational institutions supported by a public tax shall remain under the absolute and exclusive control of the state. So if you think that church schools are going to start accepting public tax money and turn over all of the control and supervision of their educational institutions to the state, you've got another thing coming. They're not going to do that. This is taking public money comes with some significant strings attached, and so I think that's raising an issue that's not going to happen unless they actually change into public schools.
Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, the House has before it for final consideration House Concurrent Resolution 3037. The clerk will open the key and you may record your vote. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? The key will be closed and the clerk will take the record. Final vote shows 47 yea, 47 nay. House Concurrent Resolution 3037 declared failed. Continuing on the 11th order of business, the House has before it House Concurrent Resolution